Well, I've always loved road trips, especially at Christmas time. Anybody else out there like road trips? Any road trippers out there? I love them. They're great times to just enjoy the scenery, to talk, one of the things about driving is that you can't be on your phone. So guess what? You have to talk to the people that you're sitting next to, like your wife, which is wonderful. I'm sure she appreciates that. I love listening to music. I usually don't listen to music when I'm riding in my car. I'm either listening to the Bible or to sermons or podcasts, things like that. So when I'm in the car with my family, though, I don't put them through my podcasts, but we'll listen to music. It's just great. It's just nice and relaxing. But you know what? There's something about having kids that totally reduces the frequency of road trips. Because it can really test your patience. You know how it starts, right, with your kids, like a Christmas. You're traveling to see family at Christmas time, right? You know how it starts. You're all sweetly singing Christmas carols. You've got your full hot cup of coffee, and you're just singing together, and it's really nice. But 3 hours in to the trip, we've had to stop at the bathroom for the third time in 3 hours, and Susie stole Willie's teddy bear, and you're like, don't make me come back there. Right? Come on. You said it. And Bobby won't stop asking how much longer, and you say, 10 more hours. Be quiet. Don't ask again. For at least 9 hours, right? Well, we've all been there, right? Taking kids on road trips is a great way to learn patience. Did you know that Jesus went on road trips with his disciples? And he had to show some patience too. Not because they had to stop for the bathroom all the time, but for some other reasons. We'll get to that in a second. Well, in fact, Jesus' road trips, they were more like boat trips. You see, in the ancient world, they didn't have cars and roads like we do, but Jesus and his disciples and many people were in and around where Jesus lived at the time, they would take boat trips all the time. Boating for us today is really fun and really, really safe. How many of you, in fact, we're in West Michigan, right? How many of you have ever been on a boat on the water, on the open water, Lake Michigan, Muskegon Lake, Spring Lake, something like that? Mona Lake, you guys been on one of those lakes before? I mean, a lot of us probably have gotten out on a boat at least at some point in our lives. Now, our boats are really safe. They're made out of fiberglass or aluminum. We put life jackets on the boats. Most of us can swim. These days, we swim maybe recreationally. Maybe we learned how to do that when we grew up. We have a Coast Guard that keeps an eye on us. Thank you, Coast Guard. We have radar and sonar and radio and electric lights for our boats. But even as of 150 years ago, think about this for a second. 150 years ago, that kind of technology and those kinds of supports and rules and regulations, they did not exist. As recent as 150 years ago, boating was very, very different than it is today. In fact, 150 years ago, boating was much more similar to the kind of boating they did in Jesus' day than it is similar to us. Technology's advanced that quickly, that recently. In fact, you may have caught this newspaper article of the shipwreck of the 120-foot schooner, the Contest. How many of you saw that newspaper article? The wreck was uncovered. It's sitting underneath the shores in Whitehall. I think we have a picture of it. Did anybody get up there and get to see it? A few of you. I was going to try and get up there, but we just couldn't find the time. Really amazing that a 150-year-old shipwreck would be uncovered. It's been under the shore there for a long time. But that shipwreck is a reminder of how dangerous boating was, how dangerous boat trips, road trips were for even Jesus in his day. In fact, I've got another picture I want to throw up. This is a picture of a 2,000-year-old, 27-foot fishing boat that was discovered just a few decades ago on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. This shipwreck was uncovered one day. And this boat is obviously it's not the exact boat Jesus would travel on with his disciples, but it's very similar to the boat that they would have used. And notice that it's not very big. It's only 27 feet long. That's a relatively small vessel, especially for 13 men, and especially on the Sea of Galilee, which is 13 miles long, 8 miles wide, with depths reaching up to 140 feet. It's a relatively small boat compared to the contest, which came in at 124 feet. I say all this because I want to set the stage for us as we recognize the danger of boating in the ancient world. Now, these were expert sailors, most of them were what Jesus was with, but it was a dangerous thing to go on a boat trip in Jesus' day. We need to feel that as we hear some of the stories we're going to talk about today. But first, I wanted to do a quick review of what we've been doing as a church family over the past few weeks. This Christmas season, we've been focusing on why Jesus came. What was his life mission? Yes, he was born as a baby in a manger, and that's what we celebrate on Christmas. But by the end of his life, he was giving his life up for the sins of the world at the cross. But what did Jesus do in between? What was his life mission between the manger and the cross? Well, we've been talking about how Jesus was a missionary. He had a mission from God throughout the course of his life. Because we often, I think, forget about what Jesus was doing during his life, we might think about him as a baby in a manger, or as a sacrifice, a substitute for our sin on the cross, or as a resurrected king. We sometimes forget about what he was doing in his life, and it's so important that we understand what Jesus did during his life, because in Mark, as we'll see this, and just in January, we're going to look at this, Jesus says to his disciples, "Follow me." We've got to understand what Jesus' life mission was, because he's going to tell us to follow him. Well, Jesus' life mission was to spread God's kingdom through what he said and what he did. A fascinating feature throughout the Gospel of Mark, especially in Mark 4 through 8, is all the different locations he travels to. In chapters 1 through 3, this is review. In chapters 1 through 3, remember, Jesus spent the most of his time ministering on mission in Galilee, which was where most of his disciples were from. But in Mark 4 through 8, Jesus travels all over the place. He heads back to Galilee for pit stops, but he'll travel to all these other areas, including Gentile areas, places like the land of the Gerasenes or the city of Tyre. And Mark is telling this story this way because he wants us to see the kind of missionary that Jesus was. In Mark chapter 4, Jesus tells a story about a farmer who scatters seed all over the place, right, on both bad soil and good soil. But he doesn't care. He just scatters the seed. And Jesus becomes, in Mark 4 through 8, Jesus becomes like that farmer, scattering seed on all the different kinds of soil. He's spreading God's kingdom, that's the seed, spreading the word of God's kingdom through what he says and what he does, wherever he goes. And sometimes that seed is going to land on soil that you'd think would be bad soil, like the Gentiles, or like women. In Jesus' day, Gentiles and women were second-class human beings. The Jews did not expect much, especially spiritually, from those folks. And but what Jesus shows over and over again when he plants seeds in their lives, they respond like the good soil. And in fact, it's the people of Galilee, the Jewish people, the religious leaders. Even as we'll see the disciples today, they're the ones that are the bad soil. And it's a bit shocking, frankly. Well, what's all this mean for us? Well, the first question we should be asking ourselves is, am I good soil for Jesus? Am I good soil for Jesus? At Calvary, we talk about learning from Jesus. That is, we're not just filling our minds, our brains with a bunch of head knowledge, but we're looking at Jesus, learning from Jesus in the sense that we want it to transform our lives. That's what it means to learn from Jesus. So are we good soil? Are we embracing Jesus, hearing what he says, internalizing it, and living it out? The second question we need to ask ourselves, though, is, are we becoming sowers of the word, just like Jesus was? We talk at Calvary about serving the community. Are we engaged with the people of our community, sowing the words, being on Jesus' kingdom mission wherever we go? I mean, this was his life mission between the manger and the cross. He was spreading God's kingdom wherever we went. We ought to be doing the same exact kind of thing. And so what we've been learning so far about Jesus' mission in Mark 4 through 8 is we've been learning that Jesus was on a mission to heal people physically, spiritually, psychologically, relationally. We've been learning that Jesus stayed on mission despite intense opposition and suffering. And last week we talked about how Jesus was on a mission to reach out to even the most unlikely of people. But today, we're going to learn from Mark 4 through 8 that Jesus invites unworthy followers into his mission. Let me say that one more time. Jesus invites unworthy followers into his mission. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at 3 boat trips that Jesus went on today. If you have your Bibles, you can turn to the first one in Mark 4. These 3 boat trips take place throughout the Gospel of Mark, specifically in chapters 4 through 8. They take place, first of all, in chapter 4, then at the end of chapter 6, and in the middle of chapter 8. And so we'll be looking at those this morning. These boat trips represent, if you will, the road trips between all the pit stops on Jesus' mission. As Jesus was going about spreading the word, as that farmer spreading the seed on good and bad soil, Jesus is also spending time with his disciples, debriefing with them between each of these missions, talking to them. They're trying to understand him more and more, failing at that. We'll see that in a few minutes. But Jesus is working with his disciples to bring them along so that they'll follow him on his life mission. So Mark 4, verse 35 is the first story that we'll read. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side, leaving the crowd behind." They took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also others in the boat with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drowned?" I want you to check out this painting from Rembrandt really quick. This is one of his paintings called Calming the Storm. I don't know if you can see it very well. It's a little dim up there, but I want you to notice some things going on with the disciples in this painting. It really captures the panic and desperation of this story. You see at the top of the painting, there's a few disciples trying to hold the ship together. They're grabbing, I'm not a sailor. I have a sailor friend who could correct me on all this. But they're grabbing the lines and they're manning the oars and they're making sure the mast doesn't fall down and the sails stay up so they can get through the storm. You can see them struggling. But then towards the bottom of the boat, you can see the rest of the disciples are surrounding a Jesus who they just have awoken from sleep. They've just woken him up. It's very dim. You probably can't see it, but there's one man who's literally praying to Jesus. He's got his head down. He's on his knees, and his hands are folded as he pointed towards Jesus, literally asking for Jesus to save him. And then comically, Rembrandt had a little sense of humor. There's actually one disciple at the very bottom with his head overboard and his hands like this, and he must be spilling his lunch. That's all he can. It's kind of comical, actually, from this really great painting. There's a guy, one of the disciples is just really not doing well. That's probably one of the guys who didn't grow up as a fisherman. He's not really accustomed to boats, and so that's probably what's going on there. But I just thought this painting really captured the panic of the scene. Now, here's the thing. Do not be careful about looking down on the disciples too quickly. I mean, I know, the creator of the universe is in the boat with them, but let's be honest. Think about this. Them freaking out on the boat is no different than you freaking out if you're in an uncontrolled skid on the highway during an icy winter storm here in West Michigan. It would be no different than you freaking out on an airplane if you hit severe turbulence and you could feel the plane falling and the oxygen masks drop down. We'd all be screaming like little babies. Let's not blame the disciples here. Let's not look down on them too quickly for their desperation and for their fear. But here's how the story continues. After they wake Jesus up in verse 39. He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Now, the villain in this story is the water in this storm. Think about it like this for a second. Do you have any idea how much Satan would have loved for this boat to go down? Do you have any idea how much the forces of evil would have loved to stop the beautiful mission of Jesus in its tracks by sending that boat under the waves. The villain in this story is the storm. It's the raging seas. But Jesus wouldn't have it. Jesus in this story is showing that he has the capacity and the will to confront even the most evil of powers. Interesting side note, right after this story, we talked about this, the demon-possessed man from the land of the Gerasenes who'd come running up from Jesus. He was a social outcast, possessed by thousands of demons, just a terror. Jesus calmed the storm in him too. That's at the beginning of chapter 5. Just an interesting side note there. Now, the idea that the sea here is evil, it comes from the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, the sea is evil too. It often represents the forces of evil, and God is often depicted as the one who conquers it. For example, at creation, God hovered over the formless and empty waters and brought order and life to them. In Genesis chapter 1. God delivered the Israelites through the waters, right? Saved them, even though they came crashing down on Pharaoh and the armies of Egypt. God delivered Israel through the waters when he parted the Red Sea. And in fact, there's this fascinating psalm, Psalm 107, that literally depicts God as one who stills the storm and hushes the sea. Psalm 107, just like what Jesus is doing here. Stilling the storm, hushing the sea. So what Mark is doing here is he is portraying Jesus as God, as the one who overcomes and conquers the sea, the powers of evil. Well, though the storm has been calmed, the disciples appear to be even more afraid than they were before. I find this so fascinating in the story. I mean, they were freaking out in that painting. They were freaking out, Jesus, save us. But it's not until after the storm that they're even more terrified than before. Their fear hasn't gone away. As they look at Jesus and wonder themselves, who is this that the wind and the waves even obey him? It's almost like they having seen Jesus do this, they're more afraid of him than they were of the storm. And they're struggling, they're grappling to understand who he is. Now, of course, we have the hindsight of the resurrection. We know all these things about Jesus, and we can see it all, but you got to understand the disciples are wrestling with this stuff in real time. Just like you may not always understand who God is and what he's all about, and you may wrestle with doubts and with fear, the disciples had to go through the exact same thing. But Jesus is frustrated. He's frustrated with their lack of faith and a lot of their fear. But he's patiently and persistently inviting them to follow him. Can you imagine if after he calmed the storm and the disciples started to voice their lack of faith or their fear? Could you imagine if Jesus had said to them, okay, anybody who still doesn't get who I am, off the boat, jump off right now. Of course not. Jesus is patient. He keeps them in the boat and keeps them by himself. A little later, there's another boat trip, right after another miracle that Jesus has performed, where he fed thousands of people from a little sack lunch. We're actually going to look at that story next week. Here's Mark's account of this boat story. This is in chapter 6, verse 45. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. So Jesus has just fed this crowd, and he's going to dismiss them, but he encourages his disciples to get a head start. You go ahead of me to the other side of the lake, and I'll catch up with you later. Jesus is being very intentional here. He even in the busiest seasons of ministry, Jesus would try to carve out time, would find time to not just to get away, to be by himself, not just to rest and relax, although that was certainly part of it, but really to connect with his Father in heaven. I think we can learn something from Jesus here. In some of the times of our busiest seasons of ministry, if we're not careful to constantly be connecting with our Father in heaven, we can get lost in the busyness of the ministry itself and the details and the tasks. We've got to remember who it's all for to begin with. Jesus pulls away at this point to get some time alone with his Father. Verse 47, later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he, Jesus, was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them walking on the lake. Now, I know you might be, this is hard to imagine, walking on the lake. And I understand that for many, it might be even difficult to believe. I get it. That's scientifically impossible. But here's the thing, just really quick. If you're a believer in God, if you believe that God created the universe, if you believe that Jesus rose from the dead because of the power of God, then believing in that Jesus walked on the water shouldn't be too much of a stretch for you. But let's continue, because there's more going on in this story than simply the feat, as if that's not amazing in and of itself, than simply the feat of walking on the water. At the end of verse 48, he was about to pass by them. Hold on to that phrase, pass by them. We'll come back to that. He was about to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were afraid. See, here's what's going on. There's more here than just Jesus taking a stroll on the Sea of Galilee. Many theologians note that the words pass by are the same words used to describe when God passed by Moses, revealing himself to Moses way back at the beginning of the scriptures in Exodus 34. In this story in Exodus 34, God promised Moses, I will reveal myself to you, Moses. Now, you can't see all of me. If you saw all of me, you wouldn't be able to bear it. You would die. But I'll show you a little glimpse of my glory. So he puts Moses up on this mountain. He hides him in this little cave in the mountain. And it says that God passed by Moses. And as he passes by Moses actually, it doesn't record what Moses saw. The text only records what Moses heard. And Moses hears God saying this. He says, the Lord, or Yahweh, Yahweh. That's God's name in the Old Testament. Yahweh, Yahweh, which means I am. The Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellious in sin, yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. See, God is revealing himself to Moses here. And what does he reveal about himself? That he is a God who loves to love and even loves to show grace to those who don't deserve it. But he is a God who will not let the guilty go unpunished. Well, many think, theologians, commentators, many think that this is what Jesus was trying to do for his disciples. Just like almost echoing God's revelation of himself to Moses, now Jesus wants to echo that and reveal who God is to his disciples here on the water. But before Jesus can even do this, they start screaming because they think he's a ghost. If the unbelief and fear here of the disciples, which Jesus will rebuke, if the unbelief here wasn't so sad, this would almost be funny and comical. Here is Jesus about to teach them the greatest lesson ever. I'm God. I'm going to reveal myself to you. And they're like, it's a ghost. It's almost humorous to think about it. Jesus is getting ready for this epic moment, but the disciples are just clearly not on the same page. Not on the same page with Jesus. So Jesus speaks to them to break the tension. Immediately, halfway through verse 50, immediately he spoke to them and said, take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid. That it is I is the same phrase that they would use to translate Yahweh or I am. Many theologians think Jesus is using the name of God here, saying, I am. He's revealing himself as he is attempting to pass by the disciples. He's revealing himself as the I am, and he says, take courage, don't be afraid. Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. You see, Jesus had just fed thousands of people. Like God had dropped manna from heaven, bread on the ground, to his people as they wandered in the wilderness in the days of Moses. Jesus had fed thousands with a little sack lunch. And because they weren't making the connections between who Jesus was and who God is, they weren't making the connections, they weren't on the same page. What does the text say? What does Mark say? What does he report about what's happening to the disciples? Their hearts, even though they were amazed, their hearts were hardened. Isn't it terrifying to think that you can be amazed by Jesus and yet have a hard heart toward him? I think this is describing this phenomenon of gawking. Have you ever been driving on the highway and you see a big crash off to the side of the road, and what does everybody do? They slow down. Not just to be cautious, right? But to gawk, to be amazed at the wreck. What's happening in our hearts, though? Are we really being tender in that moment towards the people whose lives were affected and possibly lost in that wreck? Or are we gawking at some spectacle? Isn't it crazy to think that we can be amazed at Jesus and even some of the things he's done, and yet still have hard hearts toward him and who he's calling us to become? Well, the third trip comes a little later, and this is halfway through chapter 8. We'll start in chapter 8, verse 11 in Mark. It says, the Pharisees came, and by the way, this is after another feeding of a whole other group of people, thousands of people fed from a little sack lunch. The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply. Jesus sighs deeply. That's a heavy sigh. You ever done that to somebody? Jesus heavy sighed because they're asking for a sign. And he says, why? Why does this generation ask for a sign as if he hadn't already given them one many times over? Truly, I tell you, no sign will be given it. Then he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed to the other side. You see, the Pharisees are the religious leaders who have been in conflict with Jesus since Mark chapter 2. Right from the start, they were in conflict with Jesus. In fact, in Mark chapter 3, verse 6, they had decided to begin plotting the assassination of Jesus. I don't know if you remember this story. Covered it multiple months ago. But they decided to assassinate Jesus because he healed a disabled man on the Sabbath. Like that's some awful thing to do. To heal somebody on the Sabbath day is actually a beautiful thing. A beautiful sign of God's kingdom. But their hearts were so hard. And they so rejected Jesus, they began to plan his assassination. And here they are again asking Jesus to prove himself, that he's some sort of divine messenger. Well, of course, Jesus is frustrated. He heavy sighs, and he declares, I'm not giving you any signs, or shall I say, any more signs. He's already given them more than enough. You see, the Pharisees have proven themselves to be spiritually blind and spiritually deaf. They're totally unable to appreciate what Jesus is doing, who he is and what he's up to. Totally unable to appreciate it. They're that first soil, that hard-packed soil. The seeds can't even get inside and get planted. Well, verse 14, they're in the boat now, Jesus and his disciples, and the disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. I don't know what's going on here. I don't know the scene. Now, Jesus has just, for the second time, fed 1,000 people by multiplying bread and fishes from a little sack lunch. And I don't know if the disciples were like thinking to themselves, oh no, we've only got one loaf of bread for lunch today. How are we going to manage this? Just one. I don't know if they're like doubting even in this moment that Jesus can, if they need lunch, Jesus can make the lunch happen. I don't know what's happening, but here's what Jesus says in verse 15. Maybe he picked up on some of that discontentment with that one loaf and not trusting that Jesus can take care of that if needed. Jesus says in verse 15, be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, it is because we have no bread. Now, Jesus is using yeast here metaphorically, obviously. He's talking about the metaphorical yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod. He's talking about this idea that just like yeast, when you mix it into a batch of dough, I don't know a lot of what I'm talking about, though I've done it like twice in my entire life, but some of you are you guys know how to bake some bread and stuff, so you know what's going on here. But if you mix yeast into a batch of dough, what happens is it grows and it multiplies. And that's actually what you want. You want the air to form bubbles inside of the dough, and that's tasty stuff. Home-baked bread like that with the yeast in there. But Jesus is using this negatively. Beware the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. He's saying, I've seen this hard-heartedness, this stubbornness in the Pharisees and in the people that follow Herod. I've seen it. Watch out for it. It's almost like Jesus is saying, guys, you know what? This stuff can rub off on you. You're not immune to this. Be careful. Watch your hearts, or you're going to become hard-hearted just like they are. See, the Pharisees are like this group of people. They already got their answer from Jesus, but they keep coming back, asking him the same question, hoping to get a different answer. And it's this kind of hard-heartedness that Jesus warns his disciples about. Now, wait a second. Does Jesus really think that his specially chosen disciples are going to, at some point, have hard hearts like that of the Pharisees? I mean, come on. These are the people he chose to be with him and to be sent out from him. I mean, these are his guys, right? These are some of his closest friends. Does he really think that can possibly happen? That they would plot his death with the Pharisees? Well, if you know the rest of Jesus' story, you know that's exactly what happened. One of Jesus' disciples, named Judas, got infected with the yeast of the Pharisees. And by the end of the Gospel of Mark, he'll be plotting Jesus' death right along with the religious leaders because of Judas' hard heart. So Jesus' warning here is totally called for. Watch out for that stubbornness, that hard heart toward what I'm saying. The disciples, rather than understanding and really being on the same page with Jesus about that metaphor about the yeast, they're dense, and they think Jesus is talking about literal bread. I mean, here they just sat there and they just watched Jesus, now for the second time, feed thousands of people with a little lunch. But their minds must still be on lunch. And Jesus is profoundly frustrated by all this. He says to them in verse 17, aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered, 7. He said to them, do you still not understand? I can handle the bread situation. Don't you see it? Or are your hearts hardened? Jesus is deeply concerned that the hard-heartedness of the Pharisees is already working its way through his disciples. Instead of understanding more and more, we talk a lot about spiritual growth in the Christian world, growing spiritually. What we have in Mark 4-8 with the disciples is the opposite. They are coming to understand Jesus less and less. Their hearts are growing harder and harder, and they fail to understand and see who Jesus is. It's like the longer they're with him, the more they're just gone. Totally not understanding who he is. They're becoming blind, spiritually blind, and spiritually deaf, just like the Pharisees. In the Gospel of Mark, there's not going to be a lot of hope for the disciples. There's a few small glimpses, and here's one of them, though. In verse 21, you can see how Jesus is holding out hope for his disciples because he says, do you still not understand? Do you still not understand? There's a glimmer of hope here that Jesus is committed to patiently leading, teaching his disciples so that they would finally, once and for all, come to understand who he is. And not only to come to understand who he is, but to really embrace all that he's calling them to. Here's our big idea today. Jesus invites unworthy followers into his mission. See, throughout Mark's gospel, the disciples are going to look like pretty big failures. We know, however, from the New Testament book of Acts and from traditions that have been passed down to us, that they actually ended up living amazing lives for the glory of God and for the good of others. It's pretty amazing, some of the things that they did. True examples of the faith. Amazing stories. But what's interesting, though, is that's not how the disciples told their story. It's not how they told it. They tell their story in the Gospels. The Gospels are all written either by Jesus' immediate 12 disciples or, in the case of Mark and Luke, close associates to those that follow Jesus. Mark was not one of Jesus' 12 disciples, but knew the Apostle Peter very, very well. Some people think that Mark's account of Jesus is actually Peter's account. That's how he told the gospel of Jesus, and Mark wrote it down for him. You see, the Gospels are how the disciples tell their own story and how they related to Jesus. And in the Gospels, the disciples look silly. Now, you get into the book of Acts, and they're awesome. Awesome guys. But in the Gospels, they look silly. They're faith-lacking, proud, selfish, scaredy cats. That's what they are. I think they told their story like this, frankly, to show that if Jesus had to be patient with them as they learned from him, he can be patient with anyone as we learn from him. You see, despite our unbelief, our fear, our hard-heartedness, Jesus is willing to keep getting back in the boat with us and to keep inviting us into his mission. Historically, this big idea has been called the perseverance of the saints. It's a wonderful doctrine the church has been teaching for hundreds of years. It's this idea that even after we believe in Christ and even after we're baptized and begin our new life in him, we're still not perfect. And we still need God to continually pursue us and come after us, to help us grow, to keep us as his own. Let me say that again. To keep us as his own. That's what Jesus is doing with his disciples in the boat. I can trace this in my own life. When I was a child, I first became a Christian when I was 6 years old. I understood very little of who Jesus was, but I understood two things: that I was a sinner and I needed him to die in my place. I knew that I just wasn't good enough for God. I knew he deserved my all from that. But did I understand anything else? No. I was 6. I understood Legos at that point in time. But when I was a child, I misunderstood Jesus, and I thought him to simply be my ticket out of hell and my ticket to heaven. But Jesus kept patiently working on me. When I was a young adult, I thought Jesus was here just to make me feel good about myself. But he kept patiently working on me. When I became a church worker, I thought what I was doing for him was more important than what anyone else was doing. But he kept patiently working on me. As a young husband and father, I think that my family is just supposed to get in line behind my work for Jesus and just suck it up. But Jesus keeps patiently teaching me that my family is actually my primary work for him. Jesus has been patient with me. I know there's a lot more teaching he'll do yet in my own life. But I know and trust that he'll be teaching me patiently. I can't wait to think about this 10, 20, 50 years from now. If God graciously gives me one more day of life, I can't wait to think that he'll teach me something else. Whether you're a believer or not, do you understand how patient Jesus has been with you? Do you understand that? You understand how, if you're not a believer, maybe you're here today, he's drawn you, patiently drawn you to this gathering so that today, maybe for the first time, you could put your faith in him and begin following him. And we'll baptize you and walk with you as you learn from Jesus. Maybe if you are a believer, maybe you've been attending church for decades. And he keeps teaching you, and he's drawn you here today to remind you that even though you don't have your act together, he's patiently teaching you and working on you. What a stunning thought that on this random Christmas Sunday in Muskegon, Michigan, the God of the universe, who hushed the waves and quieted the storm, the God who walked on water to reveal himself to his disciples, saying, "It is I." And the God who patiently is waiting for his disciples and says, "Do you still not understand?" What a stunning thought to think that God is calling you to himself today.